My presentation is based on response by undergraduate students back home. And these are the students whose critical imagination is shaped by an array of discourses such as Fanon, Edward Said, and Albert Memmi. So for these students to separate racism with the history of colonialism is almost impossible. So that's why when we talk about, it's almost like a showdown between biography and creativity. And when they are exposed to a poet like Larkin, they raise certain questions about the working of the empire. And this is what the response I have gathered from my teaching of modern poetry module to them, which I'm going to present today. I hope it works, and I admit my understanding for Larkin is very limited. In his prose piece written in 1957, The Player Principle, Larkin stated that there are two tensions from which art springs: the tension between the artist and his material, and between the artist and his audience. This paper is based on some informal and formal and incidental responses by the undergraduate student body and audience exposed to modern poetry module, including the poet Larkin, at the Institute of English Studies, University of Punjab, Lahore, Pakistan. This also includes instructors' contributions to discussions on Larkin's place as a poet glorifying the virtues of empire. Teaching Larkin to the students familiar with the apparatus and operation of the British colonial empire is in many ways a daunting task. One of the first responses is why a poet who has been called by many critics a post-war English poet with a focus on provincial English life be taught to the student body of a former colony. Moreover, decolonizing the curriculum is a move across the global academia. Moreover, with the publication of letters, Larkin's racism is an unavoidable topic for the students trained to critique literature depicting the consequences of colonial presence in the former colonies. After the instructor encouraged the students to explore the biography of Philip Larkins and suggested them to read Eliot's theory of depersonalization and Roland Barthes' The Death of an Author, it didn't hold much ground as students began to suggest different perspectives on Larkin's racist attitudes and support for right-wing politics. They also raised concern over the poet's xenophobic inclinations embedded in the poetic imagery of segregation and discrimination. The students who read Larkin have also studied postcolonial literature and theory, and therefore they could not restrain bemusing Larkin's proclivity for white English life, his ridiculously boring ritualism, and perhaps his detestation for other cultures and ethnicities. One student commented that Larkin has both prejudice and pride. The reference to Jane Austen was inspired by students' readings of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, in which we learn that Burton's income was generated through the plantation in the Caribbean. The nexus between slavery, the modern-day immigration, and the empire's economic prosperity is broadly stated. Larkin's dislike for outsiders and immigrants can be assessed from this when one student brought me this, quote, West Indian and Pakistani germs hopping on me in the tubes. In the early 60s and 70s, there was a flux of unskilled labor from the Indian continent and other parts of South Asia. The English colonial character, which takes like a passage to India, and many more have established in the minds of the people in former colonies, constitute a background against which Larkin is scrutinized, and that is with a certain critical venom. Back in England, even the editor of the letters, Anthony Thwaites, said in a letter to the Times Literary Supplement that he found Larkin's racial prejudice repulsive. On the other hand, Larkin has been recognized as a national poet whose dislike of the black communities can be measured by his disapproval in comments such as, quote, too many fucking about at the Lord's cricket ground, and which discouraged the poet from watching cricket at the ground. In the writer's imagination, the gentleman's game is polluted by, quote, those black scum kicking up a din on the boundary, and a, quote, squad of South African police could have sorted them out. The 60s and 70s witnessed the dominance of West Indian cricket. Sadly, Larkin did not live to see the South African cricket team waiting to play the semi-final of the 1992 World Cup as the Reeboks waited for the outcome of the anti-apartheid vote back home. Admittedly, cricket is a colonial sports and was enthusiastically embraced by the former colonies. One wonders if Larkin believed cricket to be a white man's burden. In the Bollywood Oscar-winning film Lagan, the word is Sanskrit, it means tax or levy. 2001, directed by Ashutosh Gwarikar, the indigenous people are shown unable to envisage the technicalities of the game of cricket, let alone they were found unable to buy the cricket paraphernalia, and their endeavor to compete with the white English cricketers, they desperately produce a cricket ball out of rags. The cricketing metaphor is concerned to bring the English and the natives close, metaphorically on one pitch, only to discover their mutual prejudices. The film seems to suggest that cricket can heal a few wounds inflicted by the empire, and the ground used for cricket can be a place of dialogic imagination. One wonders if Larkin hated cricket, or the presence of black or colored people on the cricketing ground, and the din that he refers to is a reference to the native languages. So cricket is a pure English sport. Perhaps the same is true with the English language. To what dangerous proportion Larkin's racial imagination can mount sends a creep to any reader who reads his poems, which are often bleak and meditations on humdrum mundanity. Why a poet of Larkin's genius exemplified by such revelations that don't get yourself kids or children, marriage is a wrangle of ring, and life is first fear than boredom, would even think of despising the presence of a non-white congregation at a cricket ground? The gap between poetic belief and social practice is achingly widening. Ever since the game of cricket found its native admirers and profiteers, Caribbean cricket at least, Caribbean cricket lovers have thronged to the ground, wearing their exaggerated tropical outfits, bringing a carnival spirit. Cricket is the sporting carnivalesque, a space that can accommodate as many voices and ethnicities as one can imagine, but Larkin's purest imagination, bent on cleansing cricket, does not permit cricket to be celebrated by the Caribbean. The Caribbeans, like the Australians, Britain's penal colony, brought a certain degree of aggression to the game. Recall the Ashes Test 1932-33 series, the borderline controversy. Whether Larkin abhorred violence or aggression is difficult to establish, but how can we defend against colonial violence a form of racism? This assumption can be verified in many of his poems, neatly disparaging violence, a bane to humanity. Larkin's disliking of the black people's presence on the cricketing ground also sheds light on Larkin's psychological weirdness, a metaphor that the poet places in many of his poetic situations. Perhaps the cheapness of life maddened him, and he conceived cricket to be an art, just as Keats sees the urn unravished. And of course, the game is an art, another thing that Harold Pinter identifies gladiatorial violence in the same game. The cricket match, typically the 5 days encounter, can be both nail-biting and boring, and Larkin couldn't help talking about boredom. Let alone, in his case, the Lord's turns into a place of boredom with the black crowd creating that din. I think Larkin's preoccupation with boredom compelled him to resort to racist rants, but this can be a very flimsy argument, keeping in mind that Larkin also associated himself aesthetically and publicly with black American music, jazz. But keeping in view indigenous cultures, smarting from Eurocentrism, Larkin's poetic stature runs the risk of vulnerability as readers' interpretation of his poems struggle to find a favorable opinion. Calling the black crowd scum amounts to Nazis' obsession with generics. One can say that these are Larkin's personal views, but our tendency to merge biography with creativity is ineradicable. Therefore, characters are often fictional proxies of a writer. Consequently, Larkin's universe is bound to be challenged by a body of readers whose consciousness is sustained by the history of colonialism. Larkin's reiteration of whiteness as the privileged voice of art, the whiteness as its own audience, is disturbing, what Paul Gilroy terms as postcolonial melancholia. One wonders how Larkin would have responded to Brexit. To the opposers of the Brexit opposers, he would have said, it's not cricket. But Larkin's reluctant admirers from other cultures need to develop a habit that Larkin himself proposes in his poem, A Study of Reading Habits. To demean others, to belittle others, to reduce others is a bad habit. Edward Said talks about one such habit, the construction of the Orient based upon the garbled notion of the native as a savage and an exotic. The poem A Study of Reading Habits can be used to explain the response Larkin's verse may reap in the wake of his chauvinistic rejection of other ethnicities. Habit is the central trope, as the poet assumes that habit is a way of cultivating cognition and psychological uplift. But habit is also surfeit and boredom, as the absurdist tradition conceives habit as a form of repetition of ritual. The poet advises the readers to develop the habit of reading. Reading in this instance is not merely the surface level of reading, but a deeper and more profound engagement with concepts. Larkin's rejection of life existing outside the English Isle is also the curse of habit. The sun never sets in the British Empire, and the colonial machine is habitual of reiterating it. Macaulay's 90 Minutes is a famous document that cast in Eastern languages, Persian, Arabic, Sanskrit, and art in notorious light, the colonial habitus. On the other hand, Eliot in The Wasteland looked for sacred ideas enshrined in Bhagavati Gita. Eliot was in search of Shanti, the Sanskrit word for peace. Larkin's post-war England and industrial ghastliness cannot allow him to look for any spiritual solutions to materialistic habits. And one of the habits Larkin could not kill is the demonization of other races. The habit is deeply ingrained, but perhaps one can spare Larkin on this count, because the habit of flaunting segregation based on race is at least a post-Darwinian reality. The survival of the fittest is a habit. The habit is dogmatically internalized by the post-industrial global north and much earlier by European colonialism. Larkin poems are repeatedly a dirge on the industrial wasteland, much earlier conceived by T.S. Eliot. Now turn to global south. When Bengal was hit by famine and the file was sent to Winston Churchill, he peevishly remarked, "Why, Gandhi is still alive," writes the Indian historian Shashi Tharoor. Therefore, regarding the gravitas of colonial consciousness, Larkin does not seem to buy the romantic notion of Nobel's savage. Savagery is a habit, as much as being a racist and being civilized are the norms. Human beings are habitual of indoctrinating. History is divided between habits of civilization and of savagery. Nonchalant, Larkin suggests that books are a load of crap. Larkin's ironic twist on the habit of cultivating intellectual liberation through reading is a futile pursuit human beings have set themselves. The reading will make you a slave or habitual of ideology. One can sense the intertextual ring. All Europe contributed to the making of Kurt's Heart of Darkness by Conrad. Therefore, knowledge is a myth. The forces of racism will prove right. Hence, we have George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. Larkin, in his characteristic self-reproaching style, stated that evil was just my lot. He includes himself, an inevitable part of all evil, as he seems to suggest that the destructiveness is unavoidable. Much of Larkin's hatred of black and Asian communities is a kind of defense against evil and paradoxically of evil's perpetuation. Consequently, he also lamented the demise of England as a political power, the England which once wielded power. The poems written in the 1950s and 60s are poems about England shrinking and downsizing, the closure of colonies and outposts being no more the country they used to be. To students and readers familiar with the history of colonialism, Larkin's love for the empire is scarcely digestible. It is almost a defense of the monarchical past. But the same Larkin refused the covetous position of poet laureate. In the introduction to his first novel, Jill, we find Larkin's observation on the rationed English lifestyle. The writer is pessimistic and disillusioned as England is no more politically prurient, a perspective Margaret Rebel also explored in her novel, The Ice Age. It illustrates Larkin's love for empire, the loss of which deeply disturbed him, but as I mentioned earlier, Larkin's obsession with England and its imperial past dissuades readers from forming Larkin's image of a poet, which in Wordsworth's view is a man speaking to man, or what the Irish poet Heaney sees in the redress of poetry. Perhaps Larkin's notion of redress is very different. One cannot help thinking of Larkin's audience is only England. One cannot help thinking if Larkin's audience is only England or the larger humanity. The overall condition of public penury is blamed on Britain's imperial languishing. Similarly, the poem At Grass, published in 1955, is an oblique nostalgia for the empire. Tom Pullen observes that there is a fusion of sunshine empire and Edwardian nostalgia. Silks at the start, against the sky, numbers and perusals outside. Squadrons of empty cars and heat and littered grass, then the long cry, hanging unhushed till it subside. to stop press columns on the street. In another poem, he implicated Harold Wilson and Britain succumbing to American pressure on the issue of Suez Canal. Larkin mocks the English political mindset now responsible for squandering political grandeur. Next year, we are to bring the soldiers home for lack of money, and it is all right. This sort of love for the empire, as Larkin's persona appears to be a warmonger, makes the poet an inauspicious anti-pacifist in the eyes of the readers, mentally ricocheted by the horror of colonialism. The poet shares the white man's burden. For a poet whose vision is pessimistic, even nihilistic, believes in military prowess, and one cannot stop wondering if Larkin, the writer of a poem like Church Going, extracts optimism from imperial adventures. This kind of impression discourages the readers from the former colony, like Pakistan or India, making an agreeable image of the poet, whose work, on the other hand, exposes the vanities of modern life. In his brilliant essay, Into the Heart of Englishness, Tom Pullen reads the beginning of Larkin's poem Afternoons from the post-imperial point of view. Summer is fading. The leaves fall in ones and twos from trees bordering the new generation, the new recreation ground. In 1951 poem, The March Past, the poet advocates for the moral and historical urgency of celebrating the Queen Jubilee. Some of my students pointed out how would Larkin have responded to the sporadic voices of dissent on Queen Elizabeth's demise and King Charles' initiation. Not my king. It is always very hard for a poet to be a custodian of an ideology. Seamus Heaney sorted out to some extent, showing his belief in the contrarian, the poem Casting and Gathering. This did not damage his Irishness, but rather solidified his reputation as a digger of verse, let alone his faith in language redeemed him. The literary recipients of a country such as Pakistan, a former colony, a country divided across ethnic and sectarian conflict, a country that has seen military takeovers, probably would be at ease with egalitarian Heaney as compared with a writer who continues to talk about the bright side of the empire and blinks at its insidious past. Can Larkin be introduced and taught without being shown as an ambassador of empire, a mouthpiece of political system, a poet who also bashes modernity, becoming a horde of boredom? It's a question. The answer is half silence, more than silence. But this is not to say that Larkin should not be studied in other cultures. Indeed, he certainly should be. Given his private views, one needs to readjust to the facts of the time he was writing. Notwithstanding, one cannot stop musing about what drove Larkin to such extremes of racism. The large body of students in a state university of Pakistan comes from the working class, who may have childhoods unspent as of Larkin. But being the recipient of Larkin's poems about fear and hatred of an insurgent labor movement does not put them in a comfortable zone. Moreover, given the legacy of the post-colonial subaltern, one who is an advocate of working class life in former colonies, arguably Larkin's neighborly and pejorative treatment of the working class blows out of proportion, and for a mind habitual of using literature and life. Should I?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, this is a little bit left. Right, so what clouds up readers from former colonies is Larkin's hatred of immigrants and labor movements. Moreover, he hardly left England and didn't bother about foreign literature, and his letters revealed his racist xenophobia against Asian and black communities. Allow me to be a little anecdotal at this point. In 2015, I visited Queen's University, Belfast, to attend a conference where I cherished two attractions, Seamus Heaney's Centre of Poetry and the library where Larkin worked as an assistant librarian. However, when I was given Larkin to teach undergraduates, I demurred from telling students that Larkin was an anti-immigrant and that he loathed outsiders. Correspondingly, while teaching Sylvia Plath and Adrian Rich, I loop in Urdu poets. Urdu is our national language. Heaney and Hughes also go along despite being antithetical adorers of nature. Only Larkin is a misfit and uniquely at odds. In the end, what rescued me from the discomfiture of relaying Larkin's racist realities to my student is Helen Wandler's Harvard lecture, How to Teach Poetry, in which she emphasizes the, quote, life situation out of which the poem is written. Thus, foremost is the principle of pleasure. Merrill Brown, in an illuminating article published in the Iowa Review, Larkin and his audience states that, Quote, modern poets, in contrast, are, if anything, excessively concerned with their audience. And, quote, there is in some a weakness in the generosity with which Larkin offers poems that will not disturb his readers. Audiences from other contexts will have to show generosity to Larkin, perhaps an amplified, more transgeographic approach to appreciate his work. Surprisingly, Larkin's poem, Wants, suggests that the poet is aware of a wavering reception destined to his poetry. Beyond all this, the wish to be alone, beneath it all, desire of oblivion runs. Thank you.